I call the Honourable Member for Murray.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. With International Women's Day just passed, I rise to speak on an issue of national significance, but which may come as a disturbing surprise for many Australians. Given our tragic history in Australia, when many Indigenous families suffered long separations or the permanent loss of their children, and many were restricted in their rights to live where they chose and partner whom they wished, it is deeply concerning to find that the rights and preferences of some Indigenous women who are about to give birth are not always respected, even when medical risk is minimal or can be virtually eliminated. This is, of course, about the failure of state and Northern Territory governments in particular to deal with the remote area needs of Indigenous mothers. While most Australian women await the imminent birth of their babies, comforted by the support of their partners, their mothers, other closer extended family or their friends, Aboriginal women living in remote parts of Australia cannot await a birth in those circumstances. At 36 weeks into her pregnancy, no matter what her state of health or how many healthy babies she has already delivered, the remote Indigenous woman is expected to board a bus or a plane and go to wait the birth somewhere near a hospital that still delivers babies. She may be accommodated in a young working man's hostel, as in Western Australia, or in a caravan park, sharing an ablutions block some distance from where her caravan is, and in the freezing cold in winter. Or she may be in a crowded dormitory. She'll rarely be escorted or have a support person with her, and she will quite often have left her other children. This may not be her first birth. She will have left the significant others in her life and her other family commitments for the 4 to 5 weeks awaiting the birth. So the pregnant woman with another child or children, which may include toddlers, she must leave them, and you can imagine the bonding issues and confusion of a younger child when their mother does reappear after 4 or 5 weeks with a brand new baby, taking up a great deal of their mother's time. Not only has the pregnant mother had to make complex arrangements with others in her community to care for her other children, her partner is not able to support her emotionally or in any other way in her final critical weeks. He cannot attend the birth, even if that has been his or his partner's wish. The pregnant woman is also without the support of her own mother or others who, in her community, can give her care, especially in those final stages of her pregnancy. As Mrs Mayer, one of the roundtable participants I'll describe in a minute, as she said, is it any wonder they do not want to leave? On the 30th of May 2013, the members of the House of Representatives Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islander Affairs Standing Committee decided to hold a roundtable discussion here in Parliament House where a number of the midwives and other medical service providers, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, could give us their views and share their experiences about these issues surrounding the birth of babies in remote Australia. At least one of these women had been living in a remote settlement herself when she first gave birth, and she was forcibly relocated. The participants at the round table, and as I say, this was conducted in May last year, included Ms Karen Atkinson, a midwife and Congress of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses, Ms Millie Hills, a project manager of the Kimberley Aboriginal Medical Services Council, Ms Anne-Marie Mayer, president of the Congress of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses, Mrs Rachel Sargent, team leader, child maternal health, Apanimpana Cape York Health Council, Ms Melusine Te Roche, coordinator, regional maternal and child health Kimberley Aboriginal Medical Services Council, and Ms Danielle Weiss, community midwife and child health nurse, again at Apanimpana Cape York Health Council. The transcript of this roundtable can be found in the official committee Hansard reports of the 30th of May last year. The committee secretariat has just rechecked with these participants just a week or so ago to make sure that I'm not reporting on something that's recently changed. I wish I was, but in fact the conditions I'm about to refer to and describe have not changed. The situation's the same for many of these, or for these remote living Indigenous women. And it's a sad situation. I quote from these midwives and the other remote area health professionals who participated. Mrs Sargent is speaking. She begins by introducing herself and she explains, "We look after 12 communities in Cape York. That averages about 160 births a year. We provide midwifery and child health services. All our child health nurses are midwives as well, so they often will have a dual role, which is great for continuity. They are fly-in, fly-out. All of our registered nurses are midwives or have partnerships with specially trained maternal and child health workers who are community-based, so they lead the way. It is a health worker-led program that we provide, taking a lot of cultural guidance and appropriate management from there. The committee then asked where the community's babies were actually born. Mrs Sargent said in Cairns Base Hospital. There's no other option. At the main delivery suite at that facility. Currently, there are no other options. If ladies dare not come down, they are considered to be absconding and threatened with the Department of Child Safety. This is at 36 weeks, a good month or more before their due date, and often they may go over. The committee chair asked, what were they threatened with? Mrs Sargent explained, and I quote, "They are threatened with the Department of Child Safety becoming involved with their management. Because if they do not leave their home at 36 weeks into their pregnancy, they are, and I quote, deemed as not responsible," end of quote. The chair asked for clarification. If in fact the Queensland Child Safety Department can actually activate official interest in the still to be born. Ms Weiss, a midwife from the Kawanyama community of 1,100 people, answered that it is an unborn risk notification, end of quote. Mrs Sargent explained, and I quote, "If they do not comply with this recommended schedule and policy of management of their antenatal care and leave their community, friends and family and go down to Cairns, they are threatened with the Department of Child Safety. It depends on a lot of other circumstances, but the threat is regularly used for ladies." Ms White stated that, quote, "It is not a government policy, it is just a threat. It is there and it is used," end of quote. Mrs Sargent added, "It is a standard practice," end of quote. The women who are sent to Cairns stay in a cheap hotel room if the much better 20-bed hostel at Edmonton is full. But this hostel is for Indigenous women only, so the women's partners cannot stay, nor their children. The women are paid a $33 a night subsidy, and so finding the rest of the cost is often very problematic. Mrs Sargent noted that in relation to accommodation at the hostel, this is very difficult when you have different clans in the same room, and it is completely inappropriate. Mrs Mayer also reported her experience of working in rural New South Wales. She said, and I quote, "I've also worked in Walgett, New South Wales, which does not seem very remote to most people, but women are not allowed to give birth at Walgett. They have to catch a bus at their own expense to Dubbo. This is 3 hours away, again at 36 weeks. There is no accommodation supplied. They have to find their own accommodation. They have their baby at Dubbo Hospital, and then a day or two afterwards, because they want to come home, they get on a bus and they come home. On day 3, the milk comes in. They have got no support, no midwife, and they do not know what to do. All their mothers bottle-fed, the whole generation of mothers before. So not only is it about where you give birth, it is a support you get before and after. There were 7 midwives from Canberra who would fly in, fly out to Walgett. Walgett is not remote, but they could not get anyone to work there. Mrs Tyrosh works in remote East Kimberley, and she reported that, and I quote, "Mine are very, very similar issues." In her words, "The birth journey for Kimberley women varies depending on where they are geographically. What it looks like for really remote communities, and particularly for East Kimberley women, is a Greyhound bus, usually a mail plane and a Greyhound bus at 36 or 38 weeks. That journey can take 2 days in and 2 days out. Women are out of hospital 2 or 3 days post-birth and back onto that Greyhound bus." End of quote. Unless the woman is under 18 or particularly unwell or high risk, there is typically no funding for an escort to accompany her on the bus or plane journey or to stay with her while she waits the birth. Obviously, all women need a safe place to give birth with appropriate facilities and expert care should there be an emergency. And many remote Indigenous women and their babies do need special medical care given the state of their health. That is widely and broadly acknowledged. However, we are concerned that for these women there are no options, even when their state of health is fine, when there are other options, and when they've previously had healthy babies. Ms Atkinson gave examples of the practice in Flinders Medical Centre, where pregnant women with rheumatic fever, heart disease, go to give birth. She stated, "The centre," and I quote, "will not accept a client that is retrieved without an escort, so if they have come, they all have an escort. And she felt that that was a very appropriate thing to do. Of course, we would all agree. But she went on to say, the main thing with ladies from the top end is that they would arrive with next to nothing, and it is freezing. They have no money, they've got no Medicare card. They might have their basic card with them, which is totally useless in Adelaide because there's only Target in the city and all the Caltax servos, and that will take the basics card. End of quote. Mrs. Sargent told the committee about the close relationship that developed between midwives and health workers and the pregnant women in remote communities. However, and I quote, when the ladies get flown out at 36 weeks, they get put into a system which is so different. No one might speak their language. They're into a hospitalised, once a week, antenatal, really busy clinic where they do not know the midwife and they will not see, they'll see somebody different every time they go, who may not be aware of the often very complex social situations and family situations that the midwives and health workers looking after them in the communities are very aware of and manage their care around. Again, it is a very daunting experience, Mrs. Sargent said. Following that round table discussion, we in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Standing Committee put together some recommendations to the Commonwealth Government. I want to refer to these now because I think this is a very significant issue and it's one we must deal with urgently, and it's one the states and territories are not dealing with as they should. The first recommendation, the Commonwealth recognises as distressing and damaging the practice of requiring, and these are recommendations I should say, the practice of requiring that Indigenous women in remote areas with normal pregnancies relocate alone to an urban area near a hospital weeks before the birth. The Commonwealth works with state and territories to change this policy of mandated removal by providing greater support and resourcing for the provision of more child health nurses and midwives in remote Indigenous communities. The Commonwealth's support improves access to safe and appropriate accommodation for Indigenous mothers and their families if they must be away from their home communities to give birth, including providing for their other children and partners. The Commonwealth provide more culturally appropriate support for mothers if they must be away from their home communities to give birth, including a skilled case manager who can communicate in the mother's language and maintain contact after the birth. The Commonwealth ensure there are resources to improve breastfeeding support for Indigenous mothers, given the women in remote areas are frequently discharged from the hospital before their breastfeeding is established. Appropriate and safe transport should be provided to women and their babies who have to leave or return to their home country. And the Commonwealth work with the state and territories to introduce an acknowledgement of the child's home country on all Indigenous children's birth certificates when the mother would normally reside in the home country but has needed to leave to give birth. This obviously is a very important matter for Indigenous children when later in their life they're wanting to register or prove their traditional ownership status in relation to a certain country. I want to stress that these recommendations are from the committee and they have no status other than as recommendations, but we have passed them to the Minister and I know he's thinking about them. We have also asked the Minister to discuss them with the appropriate state and territory ministers who have responsibility in this area. And finally, I want to say that if anyone's in any doubt about the history of women being separated from their babies in the Australian Indigenous community, I want to refer them to 1913, the 23rd of July, the South Australian Parliamentary Proceedings and the Progress Report of the Royal Commission on the Aborigines in Australia. And this is from a documentary history that I compiled, of course, in the 1970s. And it talks about removing children, in particular half-caste children, from their mothers. And the Honourable J. Jelly says, what would be a suitable age to remove them, meaning the children? And the answer is, I think, when they're about 2 or 3 years of age. And the chairman says, you'd not recommend that they be taken away when they're absolute infants. No, because then you would have the burden of them that all children are at such an age. When they're a couple of years of age, they do not require so much attention and they are still young enough to be attractive. And he says, do you think that their experience of 2 years with a black mother would seriously interfere with them? And the answer is no. There would not be time for them to establish habits and customs. And he says, I am quite aware that you are depriving the mothers of their children, and the mothers are very fond of their children, but I think it must be the rising generation who have to be considered. They are the people who are going to live on. Well, I want to say we haven't come much further from sentiments like that in Parliament if we're still having women with perfectly normal pregnancies forced to leave their home country away from their partners, their mothers, their sisters, their other children at 36 weeks of their pregnancies, where they have to spend the next 4 to 6 weeks in totally alien and to them often hostile surroundings. It's not good enough in 21st century Australia. We need to do much better. And so I really commend those recommendations we made to this government, and I hope they will receive state and territory support.